To kickstart the conversation about these issues, we are going to head right into our first panel. The topic for the first panel is how to make space security work, understanding the space domain and space systems. It is often said that space has several unique characteristics that make the application of traditional arms control and disarmament tools difficult. This panel will explore the physics of the outer space environment, such as different orbital regimes, as well as their uses. Furthermore, it will also look at the nature of space systems and their components, functions, operators, and users. Panelists will address these topics from a technical perspective and also look at how these technical characteristics condition the application of international law and wider governance tools for the space domain. I will be moderating this panel, and I'm very happy to be joined by 4 remarkable experts. To start with, we have joining us virtually Mr. Hellmut Lagos, who is the chair of the UN OEWG on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. Hellmut Lagos has been a career diplomat from Chile since 1995. And he has held several international positions. Among others, he has been the alternate permanent representative to the International Seabed Authority in Kingston. He's also been the deputy permanent representative to the United Nations in Vienna, the deputy permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament, and he has been a member of the GGE on transparency and confidence building measures for space, as well as the GGE on powers. From 2016 to 2018, he was the chair of the legal subcommittee of COPIOS in Vienna. And as I indicated before, he is currently the chair of the OEWG on reducing space threats, which had 2 sessions earlier this year. Secondly, also joining us virtually is Regina Peldszus. She is a space policy officer at the European External Action Service. Dr. Regina Peldszus is a policy officer for space security, space situational awareness, and threat response within the European External Action Service, Security and Defence Policy Directorate. She has previously worked on space situational awareness and international and interagency cooperation for space security at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs in Germany and the German Space Agency, where she served as the co-chair of the consortium implementing EU space surveillance and tracking. Earlier, she was a researcher with the European Space Agency's Space Operations Centre on Resilience Mission Control and with ESA's Astronaut Centre on Future Systems. Her background is in foresight and space infrastructure from a complex systems and design research perspective. Thirdly, we also have joining us virtually Mr. Hui Du, who is a senior engineer at the China Academy of Space Technology. Mr. Du got his master's degree of engineering from the Peking University in 2007. And from 2007 to 2015, he worked at the China Academy of Space Technology as a spacecraft system designer and was involved in more than 6 space missions and several advanced technology development programs. From 2015 to 2017, he joined the China National Space Administration as a program officer in charge of multilateral projects and space policy. From 2017 to 2019, he worked as a senior expert in space applications in the United Nations Office for Space Affairs, also known as UNOSA. Since 2019, he's been working in CAST and leads research on projects where technology is closely related to international rules. And last but certainly not least, we have here joining us in person, Ms. Joanne Wheeler, who is a managing partner at Alden Legal Limited. Joanne is a leading expert in the field of satellite and space law, policy, regulation, and spectrum issues and commercial contracts, having worked at Ofcom, the European Space Agency, and for over 20 years in private legal practice in this area. She was awarded an MBE for services to the UK space industry in 2017. Duran won the Financial Times European Legal Innovator of the Year award in 2014. She is the co-founder and chair of the Satellite Finance Network and writes a column for an international journal called Via Satellite. She is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Aeronautical Society, as well as deputy chair of the National Space Centre and chair of the National Space Academy Steering Board. She was appointed as a professor of the University of Leicester in the UK in 2022. So as you can see, we have an amazing set of panellists, and I'm very excited and very pleased to be moderating this panel. To start the discussion, we will offer the chance to panellists to offer their initial remarks on the topic, and then we will move to a period of moderated discussions. I will be asking some questions in my capacity as moderators, but I do want to underscore that we are very keen to provide the audience with the opportunity to ask questions, whether you are here in person or whether you are joining us from somewhere else in the world virtually. Therefore, I encourage all participants, if you're joining us virtually, to use the Q&A function on WebEx to submit your written questions at any time, or if you're here in person, and you have a question, to indicate it by placing your name plate vertically. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but I warn you, this is a very exciting topic, so we might not be able to get to all of you, and I apologize for that in advance. So, having said all that, let me open the floor to panellists. Firstly, I'd like to give the floor to Hellmut Lagos to provide us with his initial remarks. And I would love for you, Hellmut, to let us know why it's important for participants in processes like the OEWG that you're chairing on space threats to actually understand how the space domain works and how space systems work. And what can be done to encourage such understanding? Have you found any useful way in your role as chair of the OEWG to foster such understanding? Thank you very much, Hellmut. The floor is yours.
I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to UNIDIR for the kind invitation to participate in this important conference. This panel is aimed at understanding the space domain and space systems. This, I hope, brief presentation is very probably going to be the least exciting one, as I will only provide a policy perspective and some insight into our current work at the OEWG on space threats. From a historical perspective, it is useful to recall that the main concerns of the international community regarding human activities in outer space were already expressed in the very early stages of the space exploration era. First, by the Declaration of Legal Principles of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, and later, as we all know, by the Outer Space Treaty, a treaty that stipulates that exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and interest of all countries. And parties agreed not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any kinds of weapons of mass destruction. There is certainly no doubt about the legal validity and universality of this treaty, which constitutes the cornerstone of the international outer space regime. But the current situation is very different than it was in the late 60s, when this treaty was negotiated and entered into force. In this regard, I would like to mention just a few of the developments which have made the situation much more complex. First, the growing number of space actors, both from states as from private companies. Also, the increasing dependence of human activities from space technologies, including information and communication technologies, information for monitoring agriculture, climate change, intelligence, among many other uses. Also, the development of military technologies, including also some capabilities which may have dual use or purpose. The proliferation of satellites, the strategic value of space assets, both for the economy and also for defense objectives, and the growing interest in exploring mining resources as well. As a result of these developments, we can identify some important consequences. A few of these are an increasing competition among space actors, as has been mentioned, concern about the possible disruption of basic services that are derived from space technologies, an increasing mistrust and concern on possible threats arising from military space technologies, including the possible placement of weapons in outer space, the use of and test of anti-satellite weapons, which could potentially be used to destroy satellites, as well as many other threats, as jamming, for example, the congestion of space orbits and the creation of space debris. So there are many very complex consequences of the current status of activities in outer space. So the international community has tried to address these concerns through different initiatives. We certainly don't have time now to elaborate on them. But I would like to mention that one of the main differences in approaches has been that some states have insisted in the importance of negotiating legally binding instruments, while others have been promoting voluntary non-binding commitments. A new approach has been this focus on the responsible behaviors by states, which underlies the process of this OEWG on space threats. And in this regard, it may be useful to recall the mandate of the resolution that was adopted last year and that has established this new group. First of all, the mandate is to assess the existing international legal and regulatory frameworks, then to consider the current and future threats by states to space systems and the actions, activities, and omissions that could be considered irresponsible. And finally, to make recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. I sincerely believe that this new approach, focused on behaviors rather than capabilities, represents a valuable opportunity because it allows us all to engage in a more innovative discussion. Despite the adverse international context and low expectations, I am pleased to share that the first two sessions have been interactive and rather constructive, and most delegations have recognized the increasing dependence of humanity on outer space science and technologies. And they have also, of course, expressed concern about the different threat perceptions. And I would like to highlight that this approach on focusing on responsible behavior has received a rather broad support so far, but I also need to mention that some doubts still persist. In the next session, we will be able to start discussing about proposals on norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. Now, to get into the question asked by Almudena, I would like to say that understanding of space physics and systems is not only positive, but it is absolutely necessary for the enactment of laws without and norms and rules. Without this consideration and understanding, we have the risk of getting into a process where diplomats will negotiate rules and norms and principles that not necessarily apply or are updated with the current status of activities and of the physical conditions of these activities in outer space. And so we need, as policymakers, to be able to be just as be able to keep track of the development of these activities and of the physical conditions. So this understanding is absolutely key. How can we do this? Well, we have tried to incorporate experts in our work. In every session, we have had panels of experts who are, since this is an open-ended working group, and most of us are just diplomats and bureaucrats, we need the real experts to give us this information, to instruct us, to educate us. And I think that this dialogue is really important if we want to.
Thank you very much, Hellmut, for those initial remarks. And I have to say, having had the chance and the luck to work closely with you in the context of the OEWG, I agree that it's encouraging to see so many states actively engaging in the process, but also seeing so many non-governmental entities also become involved, and to see how the technical side of space and the policy side of space are coming together in the work of the OEWG to ensure that we can all better understand how the space domain works, so that when we sit down to talk about possible norms, to talk about possible regulations, they can actually be effective and make sense from a technical perspective. And it's been great seeing the experts that have joined us for the OEWG help us with this task. I absolutely agree with you. I also have to quickly apologise for not having told you all. All of you are here in the room. When somebody from outside the room is speaking, you have to use these little earplug thingies, and you can control volume and everything from your mic. Having said that, let's move on to our next speaker, Hui Du. I am particularly interested in your perspective, Hui, because you have a technical and engineering background. So I'm really keen to hear from you what your thoughts on these issues are. And I would like to know what, for you, are the key aspects from a technical perspective that you consider policymakers in multilateral processes should be aware of when it comes to understanding the space domain and space systems, precisely what Hellmut was just talking about. And do you consider, as Hellmut was also indicating in his remarks, that poor understanding of these technical aspects could hamper the creation of new policies or new regulations that could effectively ensure space security? Hui, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I just want to share some points about the space domain and about the space systems. To be very brief, my first point that the natural space environment is full of hazards. As you know, the space environment is not friendly to space systems and also to humans by nature. Because in the space environment, the natural space environment, I mean, we have the radiation belt, we have plasmas, we have meteoroids, we have cosmic rays, we have solar winds, extreme temperatures, and even the things that we take for granted on the Earth, like atmosphere, magnetic fields, and the gravity can be very damaging to space systems. So the natural space environment has already posed a lot of threats to space systems and humans in space. That's my first point. Second point, that space systems are very vulnerable because take China-Brazil Earth Resources Satellite, for example. For a typical space system, we have structure, thermal control, we have an electrical power supply, attitude and orbit control, onboard data handling, communication, and payloads like cameras, like microwave radars, like X-ray detectors. So we have a lot of things on the outer surface of this satellite. So the things, the structure and the devices on the outer surface are very vulnerable to kinetic impact by space debris, meteoroids, or other space obstacles. And also, we have a lot of electronic devices inside the satellites. They are very vulnerable to radiation caused by cosmic rays, by solar winds, by the radiation belts, by a lot of sources. And also, the communication and microwave payloads are very vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. And also, we have operating system and softwares on board, which are very vulnerable to cyber attacks, as you know. And also, we have sensors, optical payloads, which are also very vulnerable to laser beams. That's the basics there. And all the hazards bring a lot of burdens or problems to engineers, also to operators, because we have to make special designs, we have to adopt space quantified components, and make them to protect space systems from natural hazards, which has already been a great challenge for engineers. And now we have man-made hazards, which will add even more burdens to space engineers. We have to take extra protective measures, which will cost a lot of money and cost a lot of time, experiments. And now, due to the low-cost requirements or the space commercialization, a lot of non-space qualified components and materials adopted to make these systems even more vulnerable and more likely to be out of function. And this will increase the number of space debris and make the problems even worse. The fourth point is that space resources or space can be exhausted. Like 10 or 20 years ago, we could take space, orbital slots for granted. We thought that we could launch as many as satellites into Earth's orbits. But now, at the face of so many large constellations that planned, we suddenly realized that orbital resources are so limited, even for LEO orbits. And also, we have a lot of limits on electromagnetic spectrums, which we know we have exhausted UHF, VHF, C, QU, Ka, UV, and even we're using terahertz bands. And I think maybe in some years we're going to exhaust all spectrum resources. So, as resources in outer space become scarce, countries and all kinds of entities that continue with chance to grab more shares. That's the call for that. And the fifth point is that the situation will deteriorate faster and faster because it will not deteriorate at the current pace. If we come to some point, the situation will deteriorate very quickly, like the so-called Kessler effect will cause all these Earth orbits unusable. That's very sad. So, catalyzed by low-cost and commercial space activities, the sheer number of spacecraft in orbits will be enough to make outer space available for future generations. So, I think policymakers should have a sense of urgency. We should act now. We should act sooner rather than later. Okay, I think I should leave now. Thanks. Back to you, Medina.
Thank you so much, Hui, for sharing this really important perspective with us. I think us people in the security side of things, when we, at UN discussions, we sometimes forget about the fact that what you just said is very true, that space is inherently very dangerous. There are all of these safety concerns that COPIOS normally looks at, that we on the security side of things maybe don't pay as much attention to. But the fact that it's so dangerous, if through the creation of counter-space capabilities, through the testing of these capabilities, we're just aggravating the situation. And I think you really rightly pointed out that these are two sides, security and safety are two sides of one very important coin, and that is sustainability. And it's really important, as you said, space is not it's not an infinite resource. If we don't take care of it, we will not be able to benefit from all of the great things that we're able to get from space in terms of services that are essential to our daily lives. So I agree with you on the sense of urgency for policymakers. Anything that we can do to ensure that space stays sustainable and stays peaceful and stays secure is something that must be done with a high degree of urgency. So I'm pleased that that the working group that Hellmut is chairing is hopefully successfully working towards that goal. So thank you for your perspective. I would like to move on to our next speaker, who is Regina Peldszus. I would like to ask you to tell us what tools of mechanisms do you think are available to states and non-governmental entities to better understand the space domain and space systems, and to ensure that through the use of these tools or mechanisms, the space domain can stay as a secure domain? And I know that you are an SA expert, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this. The floor is yours, Regina.
Good morning to you all, and thank you so much, Hellmut, for your introduction and also for inviting a perspective of the European External Action Service. And on this question, I would like to highlight 3 points. First, on what we're trying to understand. You have the first part of your question, and then also 2 mechanisms or tools that we can use in that regard. So if we look at the space domain, and our keynote speaker and our 2 fellow panelists have already highlighted the main features and trends that we're seeing in the space domain, I would summarize that we've seen the orbital environment undergoing profound change in the last 5 years, with an unprecedented increase in objects. We've already heard it. We now have over almost, I think, 5,500 objects that are operational in orbit, with orders of magnitude higher for pieces of debris of varying sizes and different orbital regimes. But we're also seeing novel ways of operations that are based very much on maneuvering and new technologies, but a lot of degree of movement that we haven't seen in the past, of not just moving in orbits, but also moving across orbits, moving within orbits. So we're looking at something that's incredibly complex and also incredibly highly dynamic. And because a lot of space systems are dual use, can be used for different purposes and in different settings, we're also seeing a sense of ambiguity of trying to understand not just what is happening in this already highly challenging environment, but also why it is happening. Because if we don't, we risk potential for misinterpretation and miscalculation. So how do we cut through this ambiguity and complexity in a way? And I'd like to offer 2 points. One of them is monitoring through space surveillance. So space surveillance sensors such as radars, telescopes, lasers, something we can use to detect objects, to track them, to understand and determine where they are, but also where they're going to be going, so we can propagate to an extent where certain objects will be, satellites or debris. And we can relate them and feed this type of data into a database or a catalog and relate them to other objects and see, when they will be crossing paths, see where they are, and get an overall space situational awareness picture, if you will. So for instance, this type of monitoring helps you to see that an object, which you may be expecting, is not there anymore where you are expecting to see it, but it's maybe somewhere else, or the one object that you're expecting is suddenly 2 objects, or a dozen of objects, or a fragmentation, or lots of fragments. So you can see, for instance, and use this information of monitoring and space surveillance to determine and help characterize whether something that you're seeing, an event or a situation, is perhaps a fragmentation event because you have fuel left in your tank. My previous colleague highlighted already components of satellites. If you've got too much fuel left, it can explode, it's breaking up, it's an accident. Or whether you're seeing more objects because there has been an intentional kinetic manipulation or destruction. Of course, there are limits to SSA in space surveillance. The further you are away, if you're using ground-based sensors, the less you can see. The more less accurate it is. If you're further away in higher orbits, for instance, that's more challenging. Also, you cannot see everything in orbit with space situational awareness sensors. You cannot see the ground segment, which is a very important part of space infrastructure. All the antennas, data centers, mission control centers in the ground that are enabling space operations. And of course, you cannot see certain types of interference, such as electronic or cyber interferences. So this is not something that you can see with a radar or a telescope in space. And another thing you cannot see is something we call intent. So you can observe an event unfolding if you're lucky to point in the right direction with your sensors, but you can not necessarily see what is the reasoning or the causes behind this event. And this is, and here I come to my second point, why we also need non-technical means or tools of transparency and organizational and policy practices of transparency. So for instance, another example, if your spacecraft is being approached, you by another spacecraft, for instance, you could be wondering, okay, is this a conjunction or a accidental approach of your spacecraft? Or maybe you've been informed already about this and you've planned for it and you can make necessary arrangements. Or is this taking you by surprise because you didn't know what was happening and you are now left to determine with the means that you have at your disposal, with communication channels, with SSA or other means, and to understand if this is really just a hazard or an accident or an intentional act. So, and you have to then consider completely different decisions or means. So you need some kind of transparency to understand. And remember that this is all happening in an environment where objects are moving very, very fast and where you have limited availability of information, limited visibility, but also limited time and means of acting upon your decision. So limited ways of then, for instance, commanding your spacecraft, because it may be, if you're in lower Earth orbit, for instance, it's in a different passing over a different part of the world, and you don't have means of communication or commanding there. So there's a time criticality in these decisions. So in practice, if we're active in space, ideally we're being transparent about what we're doing, about what we're planning, but we also want to encourage others and seek transparency that we're hoping to provide with others. So that's the perspective of a space operator, perhaps. So these two tools, technical space surveillance monitoring and non-technical policy practices, should ideally be used cooperatively. And here I'm referring to second part of the question, how best can we use these tools? Because operating in space means that we're already dealing with highly complex systems. And that means that no single actor, whether governmental or not, can fully grasp or oversee the entirety of the system. And that means that there's always a notion of having limited amounts of information and a limited vantage point from your perspective. And you cannot see everything. So you rely on information from others, on cooperating to get this type of information and these insights. So this doesn't just refer to limitations in monitoring, because you could have sensor coverage across the world, but it really relates to the inherent characteristics of space systems, and of space infrastructure. And I'll stop here and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for that, Regina. That was really comprehensive. And I really like the point that you made about SSA providing very useful data, but not being the ultimate solution for space security issues or for monitoring or for verification purposes. An impression that we often get in policy discussions is that SSA sometimes is raised as a possible solution, as the sort of be-all, end-all that's going to solve problems for space security. But I think you very rightly pointed out that it's just a tool that has to be combined with other tools in order to be actually effective. And you highlighted transparency and confidence-building measures. I think these are key to sort of highlight intent. And this goes very hand in hand with the behavioral approach of the open-ended working group. This desire to create common understanding, to build confidence, to build bridges between different states. So I think these are all very important points. And I hope that all of the policymakers in the room took avid note of everything that you said. To move to our last speaker, but certainly not the least, we have Joanne. Thank you for being here in person. I'm very interested to hear your perspective in terms of what lessons can be learned from the commercial industry side of things, in terms of properly understanding space, the space domain, how to effectively regulate it. So the floor is yours, please. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
And it's wonderful to see people in person after several years of COVID, etc. So thank you so much for the invitation. We've heard this morning already, accelerating growth growth and significant changes have occurred in the structure and content of space activities. And especially in the last few years, increasing number of participants in space activities at all levels, growing contribution especially from the commercial private operators. More states than ever before are spacefaring nations. New space powers such as India and Israel have emerged, and different types of private actor now exerting space power. And in fact, UNCOPUOS is the fastest growing forum in the UN set of organizations, with the rapid evolution of space activities and new technologies and the expansion of countries emerging as space actors. We're also seeing, as we've also heard this morning, new innovation and technologies, close proximity missions, active debris removal, in-orbit servicing, isotropic power, space-based power, human exploration, in situ resource utilization. An awful lot for the brains in this room to deal with. There's also more forum shopping than I've ever seen before in relation to private companies analysing which states and which regulators to license or file spectrum through. I had 3 questions alone last week in this regard, and this all poses huge challenges for regulatory systems and for regulators and the international and national governance structures. Now, with this pace of innovation and technological change and growing number of objects in space, how do regulators and governments effectively regulate commercial space activities? In particular, how do they balance on one side governmental risk, safety, national, international security, reputational risk, sustainable use and access to space, with on the other side, at a national level in particular, encouraging commercialization, encouraging innovation and encouraging economic growth? Are these two aspects actually compatible, and how does regulation keep up? So we need to be realistic in regard to effectively regulation of space activities. Governments and regulators more than ever before need to understand the business models and the objectives of commercial operators, and I'd also argue commercial operators need to understand more as to the objectives of regulators and governments. So what lessons can we learn? I've chosen 4 in particular. Number 1, although we've heard this morning already, effective engagement between government and regulators and private commercial industry. Sounds easy. It's not. It needs to be ongoing and it needs to be structured. Governments and regulators have a set of tools that they can use to change policy outcomes, and they need to work very closely in partnership with industry to use those tools effectively. An increasingly competitive state environment, there is, as I've mentioned, strategic forum shopping with companies that can choose where to establish, where to license, where to be regulated. For example, if one regulator decides to impose very detailed financial standing measures or quite onerous third-party liability insurance requirements, companies can seek to license elsewhere, and they do, to potentially lax more cheaper, easier requirements. And therefore, we are inadvertently sometimes creating a race to the bottom in regulation, which would not be a good result. Sometimes by being too strict, a little bit too onerous to protect, for example, the outer space environment, we actually create a result that we do not seek to achieve. A company going to a more liberal regime where polluting satellite can be launched. So there needs to be effective engagement, communication and knowledge sharing between industry and regulators. Number 2, we need to, very simple again, we need to value space assets. We need to value space, and we need to value the infrastructure that space affords us and protect access. I mean this from the space sustainability perspective, but also the security dimension. I often see, again, unintended consequences because of the lack of national government alignment and also the alignment between states, where there can be potentially access to assets lost. I'm also seeing more what I would call privateer activities, the types of activities that need to be identified and monitored very closely and tend to be monitored and understood by commercial operators fast. By the word privateer, I refer to a historic reference where states can commission national commercial entities to undertake an activity. So commercial operators can be used by states to surreptitiously control assets. And sometimes we don't actually see what is happening until it's almost too late. And I've had several examples of this recently. Thirdly, we need to encourage and incentivize responsible behaviour, whatever that means. Again, it sounds very easy to say, but very hard in practice. What works? What doesn't work? And what are the consequences if we get it wrong? I've been putting some thought into this recently because responsible and sustainable behaviour needs to be incentivised, particularly at a commercial operator level. Now, luckily and positively, in regard to my question on forum shopping, there's an increasing appetite of companies to accept, encourage and seek out regulators that apply and implement space debris mitigation standards and sustainable practices. They're actually looking for the regulators that meet these requirements. Why? Because it allows these companies to meet environmental, social and governance, ESG requirements. And that tends to give the operators 4 advantages, and we should capitalise on this. Number 1, wider investment opportunities. Number 2, better risk for insurance purposes. Number 3, market access to other jurisdictions. And 4, simply public and industry, better reputation, enhanced reputation. And I'm working with the UK government to come up with an ESG kite mark standard, pulling together existing standards in this regard, to try and incentivise a race to the top in regard to responsible, sustainable behaviour. And fourthly, we need clear and transparent rules. We've heard that this morning already. Again, really easy to say, very hard to establish. Space activities are and need to be the subject of rules that need to be agreed internationally. Custom and practice, let's be honest, it takes too long. And entrepreneurship and innovation are moving so fast now. Regulatory clarity is essential for investment. It's essential for business planning and for commercial companies, etc. But it's also essential for regulators and governments to have a transparent, reasonable, proportionate, non-discriminatory regulation and clear practices and processes. Now, some of this is lack of understanding from the commercial side, and some of this is lack of understanding on the government side. So we need more engagement, more dialogue. And I come back to the need for industry and government partnerships more than ever before. And Almudena, if you let me summarise just very quickly, I did a report recently for a very large AI company that was looking at influencing regulation before it influenced it. And we summarised 8 aspects in regard to lessons learned from the commercial industry. Number 1, international technology used and applied across borders needs to be regulated internationally. And we need a basic level of standards to do this and to avoid that forum shopping and the race to the bottom. Number 2, cooperative endeavours are inherently more sustainable. Number 3, sustainable use and access to resources needs to be considered early on in projects. Number 4, need for regulatory flexibility, particularly for evolving technology and anticipatory regulation. Number 5, need for flexibility to enable options for participants from states and entities that may not be able to participate when the regulation and laws are being drawn up. Number 6, a mechanism to deal with this wonderful word, irresponsible behaviour. Number 7, multidisciplinary, and I do feel very strongly, international and multidisciplinary approach is so key. And lastly, very simple, don't underestimate the power of effective and ongoing industry and government engagement and diplomacy between states. And therefore, events like this are so crucial. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I took avid notes of everything you said, but I think an idea that you sort of kept repeating is the importance of communication between different stakeholders. And I couldn't agree more. I think this has been one of the focuses of the OEWG, of the recent attempts to ensure space security. And I think traditionally in the space security domain, in space security discussions, industry has been sort of hesitant to engage with states, and states haven't really seen the reasoning behind having to reach out to industry, but I think that's changing. I think in the last few years there's been a shift. Industry has realised that security is important to them, that they have a part to play, and states have also realised that industry should be engaged with. And not just industry, but I would also say other stakeholders like civil society, academia, and essentially, you know, I think this conference is a good representation of all of these stakeholders. So I couldn't agree more that engagement, that bridge building between different stakeholders is so important to create effective and long-lasting regulations. So thank you to all of the panelists for providing us with those initial remarks. We are now going to move on to the moderated discussion part of the panel. I want to encourage again everybody from the audience, whether you're here in person or whether you are somewhere else in the world joining us virtually, to ask your questions. I've been seeing a few questions in the chat virtually, so I encourage you to keep all of those going. But before I open the floor to questions from the audience, I'm going to use my absolute power as moderator to ask some of my own questions, because this was so interesting, and I definitely have a lot of questions for all of you. So an important question or an important issue that I don't believe we've touched on as much as we could have is the fact that not all states have the same degree of development when it comes to their understanding of the space domain or their access to space systems, how developed they are in terms of are they emerging spacefaring actors, are they not yet spacefaring actors. So they might not have access to all of this important knowledge that we were talking about, or know how to engage with the commercial industry, for example. So how do you think that this can impact space security, and what can be done to mitigate such possible negative effects? I think I'm going to open the floor to whoever wants to answer this question, but I would firstly like to hear from Hellmut, if that's okay.
Thank you, Almu. And also to my co-panelists who have actually provided the real scientific and technical knowledge that is necessary to reach our aim of understanding the space domain. Regarding the question by Almudena, I would first like to emphasize and recall that all states are entitled, they have the right to equal access to science and technologies that are derived from space activities, which is in consistence with the Outer Space Treaty and also many relevant United Nations General Assembly resolutions. And the other thing that I would like to say is regarding the diplomatic process is that a condition for a genuine and legitimate multilateral process is that we need to secure the active participation of all delegations. And this sounds obvious, but it is important to recognize that we have now a very broad participation by delegations from different regions of the world and the different categories of states. Some of them are spacefaring, some of them are emerging spacefaring nations, some are benefiting from space activities, but in the long run, all states are stakeholders. So it is important to recognize that in this new diplomatic process, we have a broad participation, which was not always the case. Obviously, when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated, we had very few spacefaring nations, and also in the realm of diplomacy, not all delegations were equally prepared to participate. So this is also something that is something important to mention. And in the third place, I would also like to mention that in many cases, private companies have more capabilities and more resources than the states themselves. So this is another point that I would like to highlight because governments and states, particularly from the developing world, need to try to engage in activities that allow them to have equal access to the information and to the knowledge. And in this regard, I think that one very positive development that we have observed in our process is the cross-regional initiatives that we have seen. For example, just to mention one that has been very important in our discussions is the cross-regional cooperation that we have seen between spacefaring and other non-spacefaring nations. So one of these cases is, for example, the Philippines has produced a working paper together with Germany. I think that these types of initiatives are very, very important, and I encourage as chair of this OEWG delegations to try to engage in these sorts of initiatives, not only because they allow non-spacefaring nations to get access to more information and a better understanding, but also because this is the way that we can find to break the general structure of discussions among the traditional multilateral diplomatic groups that we have seen in the traditional, particularly disarmament fora. So if we are able to have these partnerships, not only between private and states, but private companies and states, but also between different states that have not the same capabilities or levels of development, I think that this is very important. And what can be the consequences if this does not happen? Then many states will be in disadvantage, and they, even though they are not necessarily spacefaring, they will suffer the consequences if they're interested, their own national interests are not defended. So I think that this is a very important point. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hellmut. And I fully agree. I think you underscored this really important point that everybody is a stakeholder when it comes to space, and states, whether you are spacefaring or not, so you benefit from services that space technology provides, so you should be involved in the discussion. And it's so heartening to see that the OEWG is seeing such a wide engagement from states in that regard. I see that Regina has her hand up.
Thank you so much, Anu. And I would like to build briefly on Hellmut's point, which I thought was really important. On, you know, you've already highlighted that everybody's perspective is important and helps build a more robust measures and more robust and meaningful mechanisms. And we could argue, of course, also like you, Almu, said that many more than just the spacefaring nations with maneuverable assets in orbit have a stake in space, because many millions of people across the world who are not part of spacefaring nations use, to some extent, depend on space services such as navigation, Earth observation, or the products that we derive from these. I want to add another point to this, which would be the current, let's say, extension and expansion of the ground segment. So we look at assets in space, and yes, not everybody has them, and of course there's a certain prestige associated with having a satellite in orbit, and it's a way of projecting power, but also a way of really benefiting from domain. But there's a lot to be said for infrastructure that's on the ground, from data centers, control centers, sensors, relaying stations, telemetry tracking and command stations, cables. We have seen so many, like an expansion, with the expansion of actors who are spacefaring, we've also got a huge amount of infrastructure on the ground. And there's an increase, but that's very interesting in partnerships and cooperation for, cooperating, putting sensors or putting certain types of assets on the ground with partners who may or may not be spacefaring already. And I think there's a lot to be said that even if you're maybe a emerging spacefaring nation, or you're planning to perhaps do that in the future, but you have a very interesting geographical location, chances are that you're already cooperating with state or non-state actors on using this interesting geographical location for cooperating on space infrastructure. So I think there's something very important to be said on partaking in that ground segment, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And I think you raised the really important point of ground stations, which you did before as well. So sometimes when we talk about space systems, we forget that it's not just things in space, but you also have the ground stations, you also have the data that flows in between, the space component and the ground components. So that is a really important thing to bear in mind, that when we talk about space security, we're also talking about things on the ground that assist space technology. Joanne, I think you had something to say as well.
Thank you very much. I strongly agree with Hellmut, the need to secure active participation of all delegations, and the fact that some companies have more resources and knowledge than states. I think your question is incredibly pertinent, with more states entering the space domain, and we're seeing more changes with smaller, lesser-known countries enter the space domain to grow the space capabilities, etc., and with technical capabilities. I want to mention one contentious thing and one potential solution. Under international law, states need to authorize and continually supervise their activities of their private commercial operators. I remember when I was studying space law 30 years ago, my professor said a very contentious question: are all states responsible states? There's no assessment as to whether states are fit or experienced or able to discharge their international duties, and it's a matter at the moment for the nation states, bearing in mind also what I've mentioned about forum shopping, and the fact that companies can actually choose where to license for maybe ease of regulation. And it is a problem, because when I seek, for example, 40, 50 spectrum licenses across nations, I do see some nations struggle as to how they actually regulate. And if anything, I would seek to help them or give them examples of how other states do this. A lot of governments correctly call for inclusivity for emerging space nations and collaboration, cooperation, etc., capacity building and education. And I strongly, firmly believe that this is incredibly important. However, cooperation has proved, let's be honest, patchy in some areas, and goals for cooperation have not kept up with the race for developments in technological change. And I thought it was very interesting that the keynote speaker today, who was excellent, also mentioned that maybe we need to encourage cooperation through mechanisms. She mentioned, and I also firmly agree with this, standards. So I think there are ways to incentivize cooperation through economic, financial measures, standards, etc., rather than simply the aspirations of the Outer Space Treaty. And I do agree with her in regard to cooperation through international standards and dialogue. I come back to dialogue and communication. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you raised an issue that it's sort of been touched on by the different participants at the OEWG, the issue of, when is a state responsible? I also would add a question to that, that I don't necessarily think that being a responsible actor is a synonym for, carrying out a responsible behavior or carrying out an irresponsible behavior. Carrying out an irresponsible behavior doesn't automatically make you an irresponsible actor, if that makes sense, or does it? I think that's a question also to consider. And I agree with you on the cooperation aspect. I think that is supremely important. And again, I think that's what the multilateral process is trying to achieve, right? I see that Hui also has his hand up, so I'm going to give you the floor.
Thanks. I think also think that cooperation and participation is very important for countries that don't have the same degree of development when they're participating in the decision-making process. But I want to point out that since states like developing countries, they don't have the same capability or understanding of the space systems, and in the international space policy development process, usually they are at a very disadvantaged position because they can't understand the implications of the policies of the lines. And so I think responsible states should also make those states to understand the meaning of the policies, and also we have to make sure that our policies are fair and with full consideration of the interests of developing countries. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hui. I think you raised the issue of understanding the meaning of policies. I think this is hugely important. I think that sometimes we use the same concepts or we use the same ideas or words, but sometimes we mean different things when we say these things. So I think it's really important to also create common understanding with regards to this across all different states, whether spacefaring or non-spacefaring. And actually at Unity, we're trying to do this through a project that we hope to launch very soon, the Space Security Lexicon, where we kind of like try to look at terms that might be contentious in terms of how different states interpret them, and sort of highlight that these common terms used very frequently can actually mean different things to different actors. So that's also very important to keep in mind when you sit down to negotiate. We are getting quite a few questions from the people joining us virtually, but I also, yes, I see hands up, that's great. Since the virtual people were here first, I'm going to allow them to ask their questions first. And so firstly, I'm going to read out a question by Mr. David Morazzo, who says that the deploying larger numbers of the same satellites or systems to perform the same mission creates congestion. And so in an effort to slow proliferation, can the panel talk about some complementary resilience measures that space neighbours can take? And also going back to the responsible, non-responsible side of things, when we talk about these issues, the topic of enforcement usually comes up. And so David is asking what type of punitive measures could theoretically be taken by the space community to sort of ensure that regulations are being enforced. I think that Hellmut might be the first possible speaker to answer this.
Thank you. First, I would like to say something on the second question about the punitive measures. I think that that is something that we as an international community need to think about. But at the same time, I need to say that I think we're not there yet. we still have to find an agreement on what we consider, what type of activities we consider irresponsible. And there are also questions about the different possibilities of verifying whether a state has incurred into irresponsible behavior. A few years ago, there was a point made by many that there was no possible verification on issues regarding arms control in outer space and different types of activities and behavior in outer space. But just as the capabilities of states have evolved, so have also the technological possibilities of monitoring and controlling activities by other states. So now there are actually possibilities to verify many of the activities of states. So there is an evolution in that regard, and so that is something that, as a first step, we need to be able to do to agree on which of these activities are actually can be qualified as irresponsible, and that is actually part of the mandate of our group. And it's easy to say, but there are still different views on what type of activities can be considered irresponsible. And later, in a later stage, we would need to discuss about verification mechanisms, and also try to agree on possible consequences of establishing that the state has incurred into irresponsible behavior. But I think that at least as in my role as chair, it would not be correct to start talking about punitive measures. But I am open to hear suggestions from the delegation in this regard. But we're not in that stage of the discussion yet. Thank you. And regarding the first question on resilience measures, about the possibility of congestion, I also see that this is related with the miscalculation and the misperception that still unfortunately exists among states regarding the activities of other states. So the risks and that are involved can be mitigated, but we need to reduce the mistrust and the possibility of miscalculation and possible escalation that can eventually turn in not only into an incident, but even more into a conflict. But this question, I think, involves both safety issues and security issues. So there is an area that has to do with sustainability, and another one which is actually related to security. But in both cases, there is a need to take actions to make states more resilient and be able to reduce the possibility of miscalculation in this regard. As this is more a technical issue, I will leave it there from my part. Thank you.
Thank you for raising again the point on needing further common understanding. I fully agree that it's difficult to talk about enforcement or punitive measures when we don't really know what responsible or irresponsible means. And also, I would highlight and I would put it to the room to consider, to the physical and the virtual rooms, that sometimes we talk about behaviours or acts that are bad or that could be considered irresponsible, but we don't always link it to the actual hard law that we have. I think the Outer Space Treaty provides such a useful framework that we sometimes forget. So how do these activities relate to the principles that are enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty? Do they constitute, for example, a violation of the due regard principle enshrined in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, or do they not reach that threshold? So those things I think are important also to consider by different actors as we continue to discuss these issues. I don't know if any other speaker wants to answer this question or share their views on this question. Joanne, please.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question, actually. I'm not going to contribute too much because I think Hellmut articulated the issue about punitive damages very, very well. I would just add that it also does come down to the licensing authority and conditions they might impose. But on regards to resilience issues, I do think this is an important question. People say that the single biggest issue that we could add, or the single biggest mitigation factor, is propulsion. But I've been working with several governments to look at propulsion, and propulsion at the end of the day is energy. And sometimes, depending on who is controlling that energy and what that energy is, it actually can make the situation in space worse. But in regard to resilience measures, I just wanted to mention a few things. Propulsion is important to look at. The next one is maneuverability. What maneuvers should be made? Who makes them? Who has control? How is it exercised? Looking at different orbital planes, and it's very important, for example, when you've got SpaceX and OneWeb, that the UK and the US are working in tandem very, very closely, especially if either of those companies are seeking to license through many other countries, which I believe they are. Standards are important to keep up to date. It's interesting that FCC's note in regards to the 5-year rule, bringing that down quite considerably. Spectrum coordination, more important than ever. And let's consider the issue, again, fairly contentious, of orbital capacity in space and at different planes. How many objects can we genuinely put up there? There's a professor, Hugh Lewis in Southampton, who feels it's 10,000. Maybe that's a low number. Other people think that's way too high. It then comes back to the nation state of applying these aspects in licensing regimes to try and control this resilience. And I'm seeing across different countries the licensing regimes changing to say you can launch a constellation of more than 200, but what is the demise of the satellites? We would actually like you to partner with ADR companies, in-orbit service companies, to manage, maneuver, and the demise of your constellation. Interesting. And then an issue that's come up in the last few weeks is the use of third-party data to manage constellations. Not all data is the same, it seems. So depending on where the data is coming from, there can be conflicts, and that bodes interesting liability issues. And just quickly, lastly, standards are incredibly important, but they're not complete. There are still gaps in standards for constellations and ADR, and we need to work in tandem to close those gaps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad that you brought up the issue of orbital planes and orbital capacity. I have so many questions about that, and I am tempted to exercise my absolute power as moderator, but I'm going to resist that temptation because I know that we have some questions from the audience also here in person in Geneva. So I would ask you again to raise your hands if you have questions so that we might take a question. First here in front of me, Mr. Foyne.
Yes, I'm Bernard Foyne. I would like to bounce on some of what you have said. So great panels, diversities of views. I've heard a lot about the regulation part, the work of at legal level, our policymakers, international, national. But I was quite inspired by what Joanne described, because there is also some other activities beyond what the legal realm is, which is commercial, we the people. And so I wanted to see what concrete actions could we go on, in particular, if you want to engage with the other stakeholders, academia, industry, these new entrepreneurs, the finance that you mentioned. And we have also, I believe, the most valuable space resource. This is the human creativity on Earth and getting our people to develop technology, knowledge to benefit everybody. So can we start some program where you would have, for instance, grants for young professionals in all the areas we mentioned, access to data, AI analytics, maybe disarmament research, maybe you could fund that in UNIDIR, other areas where we could really put together an ecosystem of really a catalyzer for some of these grants. So now I have to say I'm biased now because I'm now a professor of space engineering at École Polytechnique of Lausanne and also in Leiden, and at International Space University, but I see a large population, not only in space universities, but also in many other non-space universities where they are eager to also develop services, have startups which could analyze the data you mentioned. Will it help you also to find some solution, some business activities, some jobs? So anything we could start or continue from here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in terms of, to summarize your question, concrete actions that different stakeholders can undertake, I'm guessing that particularly you mean states, to engage other stakeholders such as the commercial industry. Or like
I think that clearly states should be involved in partnership, but are looking how and also international entity, but also commercial actors, national.
Sure.
Putting together an ecosystem where we fund maybe 1 million young professionals worldwide to address these problems.
Perfect. So concrete actions to engage all stakeholders. Joanna, I saw you taking notes. Perhaps you'd like to be first?
So if you allow me to mention one thing that's taking 4 years to develop with a few people in this room, including some fantastic discussions with Secure World Foundation, always fantastic discussions with them. A few years ago, I did something a bit radical. I phoned up the head of McKinsey, the CEO of McKinsey, and said, I'm quite worried about space sustainability. And I'm wondering if we can bring together finance, insurance, academia, data expert, commercial industry, adjacent and non-adjacent industries, a whole wide, and Indigenous people, to see if we can come up with a new concept of environmental, social and governance aspects for space sustainability. And instead of putting the phone down immediately, he said, Joanne, in a few days' time, I'm changing the whole of the website of McKinsey to sustainability, inclusion and growth internationally. The headquarters for this new piece of work for McKinsey is Switzerland, dare I say, of course. But actually it's bringing together different groups of people, the finance sector, because they're investing and stimulating incentives for the commercial operators. Insurance, and actually the concept of this ESG for this kite mark was endorsed by Lloyd's of London just 2 weeks ago. Because it betters their risk and allows them to insure more small activities. Academia are being pulled together, data scientists, vital, commercial industry, nuclear, oil and gas, maritime, etc. And let's be honest, it's really important because of the uses of space to deal with Indigenous people and new types of actors in space. So we're trying, wish us luck, but to pull this together internationally because it's so vital, and it's something that we should all be working in. So I completely honour what you've just said. And I'll try and turn my mic off this time. Thank you.
Can you bring it on?
Thank you for that, Joanne. And I would love to hear from Hellmut to maybe he can talk about what the open-end working group has been doing to sort of try to achieve this as well. Hellmut, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think that this has been a very interesting and important question raised by this auditor. Actually, as Almo has mentioned, we have tried in our process to incorporate experts from different backgrounds and disciplines. Because as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the fact that we are only an open-ended working group, I shouldn't say only, because it actually it is a very positive thing that we are an open-ended working group in terms of inclusivity and openness of the debate. But at the same time, it means that we have to face the challenge that most of the participants are not experts. So we need to have a structure that incorporates the real experts from the different fields, because this is such a complex issue that it is also not enough to have some legal scholar. We need people from industry and science and people that understand the physics to provide this instruction to most of us that are only diplomats to better engage into the discussions. So we have tried to do that, and it has proven to be, in my view, very positive, and because it has kicked off the discussions, and it has highlighted some points that are not obvious, and it has provided a better understanding of the real situation. But apart from that, I would like to also mention that I fully agree with what Johan has said, and I am really thrilled and excited about the possibilities of incorporating all sorts of stakeholders in these discussions and in the realm of the activities in outer space, and to have a even broader discussion about sustainability, space security, and also other issues that are so dear to us now, values that we uphold on Earth, like some of them have been mentioned, like inclusivity, to incorporate indigenous people and their views. But I would also like to add other element. When we discuss about climate change, which is such a sexy subject for many young people today on Earth, we forget that there should not be a separation between the awareness of to protect our planet and the environment on Earth, and completely forget about outer space. We also need to have a holistic view that incorporates outer space in the discussions about climate and change and about the protection of the environment. I think the environmental dimension of space activities is extremely important, and is something that sometimes is only limited to a discussion by some groups of experts, but in academics. But I don't feel that there is enough public awareness of this link, and we still need to work on that. And I just give that as an example of how we need to incorporate different perspectives and disciplines and elements and to the discussions about the space activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Hellmut. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that it's not just from a policy perspective, right, that the space environment should be taken care of, but also from a legal perspective, states have the duty to care for the environment outside of their own jurisdictions, which would include space. And so it's important that we acknowledge this more in processes that deal with space security and space sustainability and also space safety. But I think the space safety people are more aware of that than us in the space security side of things. So thank you for bringing that up. I see that Regina also has her hand up, so I'm going to give the floor to her.
Briefly, just one more point on like a pragmatic way to include stakeholders, which connects also to the question before on the proliferation of objects and resilience. So it's more of a, like you said, a sustainability and a safety question than security for that matter. But on the EU side, for instance, this year we've been working a lot on, looking at the increase in objects and managing space traffic and increasing our capability for collision avoidance to make sure that at least, that on the safety side, we are able to act, to be more active. So we're currently in the process of setting up a stakeholder mechanism that's going to bring together operators, regulators, civil society, people dealing with international dimension of space safety and sustainability, actors developing capabilities, and we are bringing them together to talk about this same problem together, because I think it's really important that we have, the practitioners in the room at the same time as the policymakers and the lawmakers. So this is something that we're fostering at the moment, and we'll see a lot more of that in the coming years on our side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now that you said that, I also want to say that this is something that we've been trying to foster at UNIDIR as well. We've been trying to sort of be in whatever way we can a sort of nexus between states and other stakeholders, and to do that we've last year we had our first industry engagement workshop where we met with representatives from industry from different parts of the world, and sort of asked them what their concerns were, what they thought states should be doing to ensure space security, and it proved to be a really useful discussion, and we hope to continue to do this in the future. So I agree with you, Regina, that I think this closer engagement is going to be more of a trend as we move on. Unfortunately, we are very close to the time, and we still have a few questions. People have been very patient. I see, I think, a couple of people over there that have their name plates up. So I see, I don't really see your name over there, but if you can maybe introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yes. So my name is Louison Mazot, and I'm working for the GCSP as research officer. So my question is quite specific into WHEDO. Could you further develop the notion of electromagnetic spectrums exhaustion, which you mentioned during your presentation? Contrary to congestion and the proliferation of space debris, which are often addressed, this is perhaps less covered in current multilateral discussions. So what are the processes and mechanisms favoring this trend? What are the existing measures to mitigate it? And which steps could private actors and governments implement to address this issue? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a couple more questions just to make sure that we can get as many as possible before the end of the panel. I see one at the very end.
I have mine of the One Goal Initiative. This is a question for Mr. Hellmut Lagos. You mentioned that private actors often have more capabilities than states. Now the question is, which portion of state capabilities are independent from private actors or are proprietary to states? This can be from a financial point of view, or from a resources point of view, or from a technological point of view.
My name is Helen Tung, and I'm a lawyer entrepreneur. So as you are all talking, one thought came to me, because I work with entrepreneurs and I also advise states as well, carbon trading. And I really feel strongly the notion of hit it where the pocket hurts. Sorry to say it like that, like an entrepreneur myself. The financing side. So to give you a really good idea, back in 2002, when I studied as an international law on environmental law, nobody cared about sustainable development. Nobody cared about the idea of carbon trading. In fact, Europe back then wanted to kickstart it. It took 20 years almost to get the ball rolling. So what I want to say is everything we need is there. The ideas, the concepts, the willpower, the funding. It's connecting the dots and aligning where it makes sense. So the beautiful thing is, I think if we let industry lead, don't do it the other way around, which has always been the case, i.e. the states, let the industry lead. Investors go where it makes sense. So with ESG, and I totally agree with Joanne, everything she said, you get the industry involved, they lead, they invest where it makes sense, and the punishment is also there. Of course, you go from, and I want the industry to lead, because having attended some of UNOSA's sessions, and I appreciate there are rules and regulations, it's too slow to meet whatever requirements that we need. For example, you go through the extreme of the founding of the ICJ and the ICC, where they already talked about institutions and the consequences. Industry wouldn't slap a fine on their own back because it doesn't make sense. There's no incentive to do so. But ESG does, because rightly so, and there are some amazing new space startups out here that are looking towards ESG, be it space debris, because that's where the financial investors are interested in. So one of the things I'm really interested in here, and I sort of want to be a bit proactive, is would it make sense for whether UNIDA over the 2-3 days, it's to say, right, of all the stakeholders here, what are you doing? How can we calibrate and figure out as a starting point from today, where can we work together, call upon other people so that in a year's time, we can do checks and balances and say, okay, based on your wonderful project, based on everyone's wonderful project, including the states, but really try and make industry lead. Yesterday I went, and this is a really side point.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It's because we are very short on time.
Okay, thank you.
So if you could wrap up and just in one sentence say what your question is.
Yes. Yesterday I attended the...
No. One sentence. What is your question?
If it wasn't the UN, if we have a new slate of paper with a vision of going to space, a new blank piece of paper, what would we want to do? That's what I want to encourage. So let industry lead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. As we move on to our panelists, I'm going to give you each the floor so that you may answer each of the questions that were asked. I would also ask you whether you have any sort of final remarks, final words of advice, final points that you want everybody here to take home with them. If you could also share those with us, that would be great. So firstly, I'm going to give the floor to Hui so that you may answer the question on electromagnetic energy and how to mitigate the danger that this poses. We often talk about kinetic threats, but what about non-kinetic threats like electromagnetic energy? Hui, the floor is yours.
The magnetic spectrum usage, right? I said that even electromagnetic spectrum can be exhausted because we are now moving from lower frequencies to higher frequencies, from like L band, C band to UV band to even higher bands. So with more and more services are created, we're going to use more frequency bands, but the frequency bands are limited. There is a limit. So to one point, or one day, we're going to use up all the frequency bands. As for right now, as you know, the ITU, International Telecom Organization, is union is taking care of the spectrum resources, and they have a very good mechanism in managing the spectrums, and that's very good. And also for steps that we can take, I think, from technical point of view, that for industry, maybe we can create new technical methods to more efficiently use the spectrum. Like we can use higher modulation methods, like we can use QPSK instead of BPSK to, in the same spectrum band, we can transmit more data to more efficiently use the band. And also, I think, which is not so mature, that we should release the spectrum resources as soon as possible if they are not in use, because the spectrum resources are so scarce, and there are a lot of actors are in need of spectrum resources, so we should release the spectrum resources as soon as possible. And as for my final remarks, maybe I want to say that the space environment is under continuous danger from both natural and man-made hazards. So we should take actions very soon, make sure the space activities can be sustainable, can benefit for the humankind, and also have to bear in mind that developing countries, the interests of developing countries should take in full consideration of, and that's very important for the sustainable development of the whole humankind. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Hui. I'm going to move on to Hellmut. The question for you was on private actors and their new capabilities. So please let us know what you think, and also some sort of final remarks that you may have.
Thank you very much. Well, that's not only an interesting but a difficult question, I would say. I think it is. It would be almost impossible to find a state activity that can act without relying on the capabilities and services of private companies. But I think that most of these activities are the result of cooperation between private companies and developed states, states that have a highly developed spacefaring program. But in the case of developing countries, I think that there is a need to reflect on what can be done to encourage companies to engage in these developing states, in countries that do not have a developed, highly developed spacefaring program or assets, and to do this not only as an investment opportunity, but to actually make use of the opportunity of turning these actors from developing states into real stakeholders, which they are, as we have seen today. Not only all states, but all citizens are stakeholders in regarding outer space. So I think that if I could say just a final sentence, we have seen today the need to engage in more dialogue between different disciplines and people that are involved and interested in space. There is a proliferation of processes and developments that are happening, but sometimes this is happening in a parallel way, and there is a need of a better knowledge and to work together better in order to really make progress and particularly in the common and global goals. And I agree what Professor Hu just said about the importance of the sustainable development goals and how we can make progress in this regard by working together and putting together these different types of people that are interested and are stakeholders in this debate. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hellmut. I'm going to pose to you the last question, which I think maybe could be summarized in, if you could give one recommendation on what to do to sort of ensure space security, space sustainability, what would your recommendation be? I'm going to give the floor first to Regina.
Thank you. It's funny, I was going to connect this back to the role of states, but maybe that also resonates with the question on recommendations. Coming from a supranational organization, of course, we do see a strong role for states, for sovereign actors, but also for aggregations and cooperation among states, which, the case that we have in the European Union, for instance, for space security. We see space security as an issue connected to our foreign and security policy. So I just wanted to highlight that notwithstanding the fact that we need engagement with different actors, both state and non-state actors across different institutions, across the globe, of course, we do see a strong role for states as sovereign actors who have responsibilities in the space domain for space security. So maybe to contextualize a little bit the interesting interplay that we see between industry and state actors, and how we need everybody's perspective and everybody's roles, but how ultimately also states have a clear responsibility.
Thank you very much, Regina. And now I'll give the floor to Joanne.
My last words would be more dialogue, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral and international. I'm now working with legal anthropologists, neurosurgeons, medics, finance, insurance, all of that, because actually we need that multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary international engagement now. And to just respond to Ms. Tung's question, ESG provides a framework that I think is incredibly valuable. Increasingly seen as integral to sound corporate governance, sound investment, sound insurance, ethical, responsible activities, everything we should be doing for Earth and in space, and that ecosystem that is Earth and space. And I think we should be hearing more about ESG, the environmental, social, and governance, for all of the factors that fit into what we do in space, through the multidisciplinary meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you to all of the panellists for ending in such a hopeful note. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. In fact, we've gone over the time. I apologise for that, but I think it was worth it because this was such an interesting discussion. I would like to now thank you all for being here, and especially thank all of our panellists for this really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much to everyone.